Yo, what's up, guys? Today I'm going to be ranking all the fighters from Season 2 of the K-drama Weak Hero class from weakest to strongest. A lot of you may be confused because I did make a video ranking weak hero fighters in the past. I just made it after barely paying attention to the show and just kind of wanted to make it for fun. And thus a lot of the placements and arguments are kind of invalid. So for that reason I thought I'd make another one. I would have ideally wanted to make a whole ranking between Class 1 and Class 2, but the problem is I don't really think there's a valid way to really scale the two to each other. At the most, you could maybe argue that characters like Sokde would be above Gotak, as even while suppressed, Sokde is just able to effortlessly block an attack from Penshien without showing any signs of struggle. And we see that Shien is only able to actually get the upper hand when using his phone and the pot plant. Meanwhile, Gotak does struggle a lot against a sleep-deprived version of Penshien. But that comparison isn't even really that fair, as throughout the series, Shien is shown to just retain information and grow as a fighter overall. So it would kind of be an assumption to treat every version of Shien as the same. The version that Gotak fought and the version that Sokde fought may not necessarily represent the same level of fighter. And even if we were able to accept that Class 1 fighters are above like the likes of Gotak and Songmok and stuff, the bigger issue comes when trying to compare them to the very top of Class 2. Baku and Baekjin are portrayed as being on an entirely different level to the rest of Class 2, with the only people who are shown to actually scale to them being the Fat Johans, who don't actually have any scaling outside of their encounters with Baekjin anyway. Because of that, I think it's just too early to make a definitive Class 1 versus Class 2 ranking. Like, Baekjin and Baku just have no anti-feats, like they just completely neg the strongest fighters in Class 2 who actually have scaling, to the point that there's not really any way to establish their ceiling because they don't really have the necessary anti-feats. Because of that, I think it's simply too early to make a definitive Class 1 versus Class 2 ranking. Hopefully when Class 3 gets released and we get to see like people like Suho in action again, we'll finally be able to see how he fares against people like Baku and Gotak. But until then, I think the fairest approach is to just keep the two classes separate. Anyways, without further ado, let me get into it. So in the no scaling tier, we have the Soknam Gorilla and Metal Knuckle Shien. These two are honestly just weird to scale because neither of them really have enough reliable scaling to other fighters. Starting off with the Soknam Gorilla, all we really see is him getting one-shotted by Baku, to the point Baku faehaxes him into submitting and joining the Union. And as for Metal Knuckle Shien, he only fights the Soknam Gorilla, and then a heavily weakened Baekjin, making it difficult to determine where this version of Shien actually belongs. At first I thought that maybe placing Metal Knuckle Shien above Penshien would be valid, as after all, in the finale Shien chose Metal Knuckles as his weapon of choice, so you could argue that he considered them the better weapon and would therefore be better with them than his pen self. But the problem is that the context doesn't really support that interpretation. The entire strategy that Shien and Baku came up with revolved around wearing Baekjin down as much as possible and just like basically destroying his limbs. Metal Knuckles are of course naturally much better suited for doing exactly that. So Shien choosing them doesn't necessarily mean he's a stronger fighter with them overall. It could simply mean they were the more effective tool for executing that specific plan against Baekjin. I also thought that maybe the Soknam Gorilla could scale above fighters like Dongha or Hyoman, because of the fact that he completely blitzes Juntae, whereas Juntae is at least able to dodge some of Dongha's attacks. But once again, the context matters here. Against the gorilla, Juntae wasn't trying to avoid the fight. He deliberately walked towards him in order to try and protect Shien. Whereas, against Dongha, Juntae was just focusing purely on escaping and evading, so naturally he was putting much more effort into avoiding attacks. Because the circumstances are just completely different, I don't think it's fair to use those scenes as evidence that the gorilla actually outspeeds Dongha. At the end of the day, I just don't think there's enough evidence to confidently place either of these two anywhere on the list. Before I actually move on to the people with scaling, there's just one argument I want to address because I've actually seen people claim that Metal Knuckle Shien is stronger than full power Baekjin. Yeah, people actually argue this, which is ridiculous. The reasoning usually goes something like this. Shien had just been choked unconscious by the Soknam Gorilla, so he was more weakened than Baekjin. And since he nearly beat Baekjin afterwards, that means Shien was the stronger fighter. And I just don't think this holds up at all. The entire narrative of the finale revolves around one idea. Baekjin is too strong to defeat head-on. Shien's whole entire plan was to literally just stall and hold Bigton off until Baku could get back up and defeat him, which just shows he knows he can't beat Bigton in a one-on-one. Because of that, I think it's far more reasonable to conclude that Bigton was the more weakened fighter. After all, Bigton had just gone through a literal death match with Baku by the time Xian fought him. Bigton had literally gone through a super intense fight to the point his limbs were completely fucked, and he only had like a brief moment of screaming at people before he would go on to then fight Xian. Whereas Xian had way more downtime between his fight with the gorilla, and was visibly on better shape upon facing Bigton, as Bigton was out of breath after his fight with Baku, and Xian just looks pretty much fine aside from a few scars, which, you know, of course, Bigton would have as well. He was bleeding. On top of that, being choked for a few seconds, which is what the gorilla did to Xian, is really not that significant of a nerf most of the time. I can't be bothered to read this whole message out, so just look at what my friend sent. But yeah, basically for these reasons, it's very silly to assume that Xian would be more weakened than Bigton. And to put the nail in the coffin, there's actually another thing that reinforces this. Even with Metal Knuckles, Xian still struggles against the Soknam gorilla, a character that Baku literally one-shots and completely intimidates into submission. And Bigton himself even considered Baku's mission to recruit the gorilla as something easy, saying that they were just Soknam pricks. So the narrative doesn't portray Gorilla as a very strong fighter at all. It consistently shows him as being someone just not on Baku and Bigton's level, and despite that he still pressed Xian a lot. That makes it very difficult to argue that Metal Knuckle Xian was already operating above someone like Bigton, considering that Baku's actor states that Baku can't beat Bigton alone, and we literally see Bigton defeat Baku. So thinking about the narrative, the actual feats, and the fact that being choked isn't really that much of a nerf, like, I would know.
What did he say?
Anyways, yeah, because of those reasons, I don't think there's really a convincing case for Metal Knuckle Xian being stronger than Bigton. For these reasons, I think it's safe to say that neither Metal Knuckle Xian nor the Soknam gorilla has enough concrete scaling to justify placing them anywhere outside of the no scaling tier. Now, this tier is C- tier. I called it C- tier because, although it's its own separate tier, I believe that the people in this tier are very relative to the people in the next tier. I just didn't want to put everyone in one tier because it just annoys me if there's too many people in one tier. So this is kind of like the next tier, but the lower end of the next tier, if that makes sense. At the bottom of this tier, we have Choi Hyoman. Hyoman is shown to be capable of bullying and intimidating many students when Baku isn't around to keep him in check. Xian is also initially unable to properly avoid his attacks until he remembers Suho's shoulder analyzing trick. Aside from that though, Hyoman doesn't really do anything too impressive, so he's at the bottom of this tier. Tied with him would be Big Dongha. Dongha is one of the Union 4 and fought on par with Hyoman. We also see that during the Union Brawl, he manages to knock Gotak to the ground. For this reason, he does have some relativity to Gotak, hence why this is C- tier and not D tier. I know it may be a little disappointing to see Dongha this low, since a lot of people hold him in very high esteem, but I believe that Gotak is simply better than Dongha, and I will get around to explaining that when I get to Gotak's placement. At the top of this tier though, we have suppressed Gum Songjae, so Songjae in the bathroom fight. The reason he ranks above the other two is because of how he performs against Xiun. Earlier in the season, Xiun's encounter with Hyoman ends without either fighter clearly overpowering the other, so for that reason we can say they're around the same level. What's important to know is that this version of Xiun is not only sleep deprived, but also focusing more on avoiding attacks rather than fighting back, as it's shown at this point that he doesn't really want to fight. However, Songjae fights a version of Xian who has not only overcome his sleep deprivation, but is no longer simply focusing purely on defending like he did earlier on in the story when he faced Hyoman. Instead, he actively begins looking for ways to win, and we even see him fighting back and shoving Songjae backwards. And we also see him looking over at the flower pot, with it of course being implied that he was about to use it as a weapon, and we literally see him do exactly that later on. Despite facing this stronger version of Xiun, Songjae is still able to fight equally to him, with neither fighter really getting the upper hand, due to the fact that Songjae is shown to be relative to a stronger version of Xian than the one who fought Hyoman, and Dongha is shown to be super relative to Hyoman. I think it's fair to place suppressed Songjae at the top of this tier. And yes, for those wondering, Songjae was suppressed, as he said that he was only coming to say hi and that he would pummel Sheehan the next time around, and we basically saw him do exactly that to a stronger version of Sheehan who was actually using his weapon of choice, the pen. At the bottom of this tier we have Do Sungmok, aka the judo guy. The reason I have him above suppressed Songjae in the previous tier is because of his scaling to Gotak. Songmok is able to fight on par with Gotak, and Gotak himself is shown to be relative to a version of Sheehan who is using his weapon of choice, the pen. Meanwhile, suppressed Songjae is only shown to be relative to an unarmed Sheehan. Based on that, I think it's fair to say that Songmok would rank above him. And I know this placement might seem a little unfair. A lot of people actually think that Songmok would be a non-suppressed Songjae. However, I think that Songmok is actually pretty overrated at the end of the day, and I don't think his fight with Songjae would even be close. In fact, I don't think Songmok was ever actually above Gotak in the first place. What do I mean by this? Well, it's a common interpretation that Songmok was stronger than Gotak before the finale, but then Gotak surpassed him after training. The evidence people usually point to is that Songmok defeats Gotak before the finale, only to lose to him in the finale. On paper that may sound reasonable, but I don't think that's actually what happened. If we look at their first encounter, Songmok initially gets the better of Gotak by throwing him to the ground. However, Gotak eventually turns the tides and gets the upper hand by throwing a kick that stuns Songmok. Dongha then interferes, giving Songmok the opportunity to recover, and he hits Gotak with a crowbar. And only after that does Songmok actually do decent. So even in the first exchange, Gotak is shown to be perfectly capable of fighting back, and even gaining the upper hand before the fight gets interrupted. And the second fight is the one people usually use to argue Songmok's superiority, but I don't think it's a fair comparison. As at this point, Gotak had already spent a significant amount of time fighting multiple union members and running from them without a chance to pause in between. We even see him panting immediately before fighting Songmok, making it clear that fatigue has already set in. Songmok on the other hand had a chance to actually take a breather before chasing after him. Like, we literally see Songmok is taking his jolly old time, whereas Gotak is just constantly running and constantly fighting and doesn't really have a moment to breathe properly. So for those reasons, it's logical that Gotak would of course be more fatigued. Because of that, I don't think Songmok defeating Gotak there proves he was a stronger fighter. It shows he can beat an opponent who has already been worn down, sure. But when the two fought under even circumstances earlier, Gotak was able to recover from Songmok's throw, and eventually gained the advantage before the fight was interrupted. Despite what people may think, the finale actually reinforces this rather than contradicting it. Although Gotak does struggle a lot with Songmok even after training, the series itself actually downplays that training. Baku even questions whether something as simple as jumping rope would make Gotak much stronger. Considering he has shitty knees, Gotak basically concedes he at least has to try train. The narrative doesn't present it as a dramatic power-up, so I don't think it's enough to conclude that Gotak suddenly surpassed someone who was previously far above him. At the most, you could argue that the training gave Gotak a slight edge and that Songmok was a little bit better before he trained. But whether you think Songmok was marginally stronger beforehand or Gotak became marginally stronger afterward, the important point is that the gap between them is very small. And even then, you could low-key argue that Gotak was at a bigger disadvantage in the Union Brawl, as he was already previously dropped by Dongha, whereas Songmok just took a hit from Baku that didn't really affect him as much. And it was also raining, which could have affected his ability to do kicks, as balance is a very crucial thing for a Taekwondo fighter like himself. Their fights consistently portray them as being in the same ballpark rather than one clearly dominating the other. Whilst we're on the topic of Songmok, I would like to also address a few arguments that people use to upscale Songmok and put him above people like Songjae. And this first argument is quite relevant to what I spoke to earlier, and it's the claim that Songmok was holding back against Gotak during their first encounter. This comes from Songmok's line where he said, "I let my guard down earlier," referring to the aforementioned moment where Gotak suddenly blitzed him and dropped him with a kick. People then point to Songmok defeating Gotak later without taking another clean hit, as evidence that he was simply suppressing himself the first time. But the thing is, I don't think that's what Songmok's statement necessarily implies. Saying you let your guard down is not the same as saying you are actively holding yourself back and not trying as hard. Those are two completely different claims. Letting your guard down can simply mean you failed to anticipate your opponent's attack, or became careless for a moment, both of which are a fucking skill issue. And realistically, why would Songmok be holding back in the first place? He's portrayed as a literal crash out and someone who takes his position in the Union seriously. Nothing about his personality suggests he'd intentionally go easy on someone like Gotak. Like, he was shown to be so pissed off at people who rebel against the Union, as shown with how he almost tried to fight Xian, and Dongha had to literally hold him back. The much more reasonable interpretation is simply that Gotak blitzed him, and that is of course a mistake on Songmok's part, not evidence that he was secretly much stronger all along. When you combine that with the fact that Songmok only actually defeats Gotak after Gotak has already been exhausted from fighting multiple Union members, and would be logically more fatigued than Songmok, I don't think there's any solid basis for claiming Songmok was significantly superior before the finale. Then in the finale, Gotak goes on to beat Songmok despite first being dropped by Dongha. Since the story itself downplays Gotak's training, with even Baku questioning whether the jumping rope would make him stronger, it just seems more likely that the two were always extremely close in strength rather than Songmok being in a completely different level. Another argument I've seen is that Songmok has better durability than Songjae. This is based on Songmok tanking a punch from Baku in the finale, whereas Songjae gets hurt by Gotak's attacks. Gotak's attacks, that sounds funny. I don't think this comparison is reliable though, as during the Union Brawl, Baku's entire objective was to focus on wearing down and defeating Baekjin. Because of that, it's entirely plausible that he wasn't putting his full power into the strike that he landed on Songmok, as he would have of course wanted to conserve his energy for when he got to Baekjin. And now I'm not saying this definitely happened, but it's a perfectly reasonable interpretation. And that alone makes it difficult to claim that Songmok surviving a punch is evidence that he scales to Baku's AP. This interpretation is also supported by the fact that Dongha gets literally one-shotted by Baku, where he's in a situation where he doesn't really have a reason to conserve his energy. And since Dongha and Songmok should be in the same general tier of AP as both Aham and Gotak, this would just further confirm this. I've also seen people argue that Dongha was already injured and Baku targeted his injury, but that's just silly. There's no evidence that Dongha was injured. Finally, I've heard the argument that Songmok fought a stronger version of Gotak than Songjae did. The reasoning is that Gotak struggled against Hyoman's group in episode 2, but later defeated several Union members before fighting Songmok, supposedly proving he had grown stronger, and I don't think this argument holds up either. This argument assumes that without evidence, Hyoman's group must be weaker than the Union members Gotak fought later, but there's no reason that has to be true. It's entirely possible that Hyoman's crew was stronger than those particular Union members. In fact, Hyoman's group regularly terrorized students who themselves were capable of competing with Union members, as shown in the brawl. So automatically assuming that they're fodder or worse is just an assumption, doesn't have to be true. Because of that, I don't think there's enough to claim that Gotak had meaningfully improved between those fights. It should be around the same level of Gotak, and like I said, Gotak is relative to Songmok, whereas Songjae just completely bitches him. So after addressing all these points, I don't think there's a convincing case for Songmok being above Songjae. At the absolute most, like I said, you could argue that Songmok was slightly stronger than pre-finale Gotak, but even that is pretty debatable. The evidence throughout the series consistently points towards Songmok and Gotak being in roughly the same ballpark, like I said. Above Songmok, we have Gotak, as he ultimately defeats Songmok when they fight in the finale. And now that I've reached Gotak's placement, I want to address the thing that I brought up earlier. Why is he above Dongha? At first glance, this may seem very weird, as we do see Dongha drop Gotak to the ground during the Union Brawl. On the surface, that looks like definitive evidence that Dongha is the better fighter. However, I don't think that one exchange is enough to conclude that Dongha is actually the better fighter. Throughout the series, we repeatedly see fighters get knocked down or lose the early exchanges of a fight, before eventually turning things around and winning. Dropping someone once simply isn't enough to establish who would win in a drawn-out fight. At the same time though, it would also of course be unfair to simply assume Gotak would turn the tides without any evidence, especially since Dongha did, get the upper hand in their direct exchange. So instead, what we need to do is actually look at the rest of the evidence and see which direction it points to. Does it point to Dongha being better or Gotak being better? Let's get into it. So first of all, there's Gotak's encounter with Hyoman. When Gotak throws a kick in Hyoman's direction, Hyoman is visibly intimidated and immediately backs off from the fight. Just seeing the speed and power of that kick is enough to make him abandon his usual aggressive attitude and duck the fade with him. This is particularly significant because Hyoman is shown to be someone who constantly picks fights with people whenever they get on his nerves. We see him immediately lash out at people like Shien and Juntae and attack him when they bother him. Yet despite being angry at Gotak, he refuses to fight him one-on-one and instead manipulates the situation so that Gotak and Shien fight each other before later jumping in with his group. That tells us a lot about how Hyoman views Gotak. The narrative reinforces this even further, as among the Eunjung students it's simply accepted that Gotak is second only to Baku. That portrayal naturally places him above someone like Hyoman. Meanwhile, Dongha literally can't even beat Hyoman and they fight on par for the entire brawl. Then there's Dongha himself. We see that another time in the series, even after catching Gotak off guard with a weapon, Gotak gets the upper hand against Dongha. So when you put everything together, I don't think Dongha winning one exchange against Gotak outweighs the consistent portrayal of Gotak throughout the series, especially since Dongha only did that after jumping in once Gotak had just fought Songmok. Dongha won a brief exchange, sure, but everything else in the show points to Gotak being the superior fighter. So for those reasons, I think it's very safe to say that he would have eventually come out on top and defeated Dongha. Tied with Gotak, however, would be Shien with a pen. The reason I place him here is because Pen Shien is able to have an inconclusive fight with a version of Gotak, who should be roughly comparable to the same Gotak who later defeats Songmok. And since neither fighter is able to decisively overcome the other, and the fight is interrupted before we actually get a clear winner, I think it's fair to place them around the same level. Some people may argue that Gotak should be above Pen Shien due to their performances against Songjae. People say this because we see a few episodes later that Gotak was able to actually land a clean hit on Songjae, whereas Shien gets disarmed pretty quickly and never actually lands a successful attack on him. People use this and show that Gotak would have eventually gotten the upper hand on Shien if their fight wasn't interrupted. And this is a pretty interesting argument. It's not bad, but I think I'd probably say it's false if I had to choose. And I say that because the environment plays a huge role in both of these fights. When Shien fights Songjae, Songjae is able to take the pen and throw it off the roof, effectively removing Shien's weapon. In contrast, Gotak fights Shien in a much narrower environment, where Gotak doesn't have the same opportunity to remove Shien's weapon. We even see that when Shien gets a chance to recover his pen against Gotak, he's immediately able to return to fighting him and start pressing him. Because of this, it's possible that the difference in their performance against Songjae is less about Gotak being definitively stronger, and more about the circumstances of their fights. If Shien had been in a situation where he could recover his pen, it's possible his performance could have looked much closer to Gotak's against Songjae. I'm not saying this proves Shien would definitely perform the same way, but it does show that Gotak landing a hit on Songjae while Shien failed to do so isn't enough to really establish a clear gap between them. So overall, I think the fairest placement is to have Gotak and Pen Shien around the same level. You could argue one over the other depending on how you interpret their fights, but at the end of the day, they're in the same ballpark in my opinion. Now in this tier, we have Gum Songjae at the bottom. It would of course be a no-brainer that Songjae is above the previous tier, as he completely overwhelms Gotak when they fight. And since I have already explained that Gotak remains around the same strength throughout Season 2, this feat alone puts Songjae above the previous fighters. He's also able to cleanly beat Pen Shien, and even if you want to argue that the environment came into play, he'd still be above because of him beating Gotak like I said. On top of that, Songjae is also shown to completely fair-hacks Hyoman. Furthermore, Songjae is heavily implied to be Baekjun's main enforcer. This is important because Baekjun is one of the most intelligent and calculating characters in the show, and he takes the Union very seriously. The fact that he trusts Songjae to handle most of his dirty work could definitely suggest that Songjae is the strongest fighter in the Union under him. Above Songjae, however, would be Choi Hyoman with a metal bat. I know it may seem strange to see this goofy-ass dude Hyoman this high, especially considering how much of a joke his character can be at times, but when you specifically give him a metal bat, his feats become pretty impressive. With the weapon, Hyoman is able to defeat Pen Shien without allowing Shien to land a single successful attack. Shien gets almost immediately disarmed and is then forced to spend the entire encounter purely defending himself, showing how dangerous Hyoman becomes when he has a metal bat. Meanwhile, Gotak, who I have already established as being relative to Pen Shien, is still able to land a successful attack on Sungjae. Because of that, I think Hyoman's performance with the metal back gives him a strong argument to rank above Sungjae. That being said, this is one of the more debatable placements. Depending on how you interpret Shin's performance against Sungjae, you could argue that Sungjae should be above metal back Hyoman, but since I lean towards the interpretation that Shin's worst performance was heavily influenced by the environment preventing him from retrieving his pen, rather than Sungjae simply being massively above him, I would say that metal back Hyoman is slightly above Sungjae, but once again, it's a matter of opinion. Now in this tier we have two of CEO Choi's bodyguards. If you watched my first video, you'll know that I'd like to call these guys the Fat Johans, because they look like chubbier versions of Johan from the show Vigilante. For that reason, I'll refer to them as the brown-haired Fat Johan and the black-haired Fat Johan. And the worst of the two would be the brown-haired Fat Johan. The reason he is above the previous tier comes down to his scaling against Baekjin. During their encounter, he's actually able to successfully evade an attack from Baekjin and react to him, showing that he at least has the speed necessary to avoid him. This is important when compared to someone like Metal Bat Hyoman, who was placed at the top of the previous tier. Despite Baekjin being involved in a much more chaotic situation and fighting multiple opponents, Hyoman is completely overwhelmed and is unable to react to Baekjin's attacks at all. Because the brown-haired Fat Johan is able to at least respond to Baekjin's attacks while Hyoman is completely dominated by him, he would of course rank above the previous tier. Above the brown-haired Fat Johan, however, would be the black-haired Fat Johan. The reason he ranks higher is because his performance against Baekjin is definitely more impressive. Unlike the brown-haired Fat Johan, who only manages to evade one attack before being bodied, the black-haired Fat Johan is able to actually sort of press Baekjin. He manages to land a clean hit on Baekjin and even stagger him, setting him against the card despite Baekjin blocking the attack. Being able to actually affect Baekjin in a fight is a much greater feat than simply avoiding one attack, so the black-haired Fat Johan would naturally rank above his brown-haired counterpart. Now at the bottom of this tier we have Baku or Park Hoo-min at the bottom. Baku is an absolute beast. He's consistently stated to be the top dog of Eunjang. He's able to completely body both Dongha and Songmok, and outside of the Fat Johans, he's the only character who's shown to actually compete with Baekjin at all. The reason Baku ranks above the previous tier is because of his performance against Baekjin. While the Fat Johans were able to sort of press and affect Baekjin in their 2-on-1, Baku is able to fight him directly and put up a much stronger performance. He's able to push Baekjin far more than the Fat Johans were able to do in the 2v1, to the point he's like almost equal with Baekjin. So he would of course be above. However, at the very top of this tier and the whole of class 2 we have Na Baekjin. The reason Baekjin ranks above Baku is because he ultimately does defeat him when they fight. Baekjin was such a massive threat that Baku and Shien had to completely change their approach and create a strategy specifically designed around wearing him down before they could defeat him. On top of that, Baekjin is the leader of the Union. His combat ability is further shown through his fight with Pen Shien, where he's able to disarm him much more effortlessly than Songjae was able to. I say this because a lot of people argue that Songjae is better than Baekjin, which is once again just another weird argument in the community. Yeah, so for those reasons he'd be the strongest in all of class 2. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Stay blessed.